All right. Well, thank you all for joining this evening. And to kick us off, I'm going to pass it to Hero.
Thanks, Adam. Welcome, everybody. For those that I have not had the opportunity to meet yet, I'm Hero Vicaria. I'm the Director of Leadership Development at NASP. We are so excited to share some updates regarding the Interstate Compact for School Psychologists. Our model legislation was introduced in December 2023. So the purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of the Interstate Compact, next steps in the process, and pursuing that state enactment piece and standing up the commission, and also information on what state leaders can do in the short and long term. So just some steps to guide all of us around that. So on that note, I'm going to welcome Adam Deersing, a senior policy analyst at the Council of State Governments, who's going to go over all of this information with us. So Adam, right back at you.
Okay, thanks, Hero. As was mentioned, my name's Adam. I am a senior policy analyst at CSG. We are a membership organization, nonpartisan, nonprofit. We've been around since the 30s and focus on helping to foster policy innovation and ideas through research-based guidance and technical assistance to all three branches of state government in all 50 states and U.S. territories. And so we are an available resource to state leaders on a multitude of issues, but specifically what we'll be focusing on today is the work that I do with the National Center for Interstate Compacts. This is a foundational policy portfolio for CSG. We've been working on this since the beginning to help states negotiate and enact interstate agreements to collectively address issues that they would rather remain purview of the states and not become federal policy issues. And so one of those is occupational licensure, and that has been kind of the prevalent trend for interstate compacts in the last 25 years or so. So we'll get into how that looks generally, as well as specifically for school psychologists. For those of you that might not know, interstate compacts are a policy tool to create binding legislative contracts between states. We all generally carry one of these around with us every day in the form of our driver's license. So this was
Bring it to me.
A policy issue that was something that the states wanted to maintain control of, but didn't see a huge benefit in having a federal voice on the issue. And so they collectively came together to develop the driver's license compact, which all 50 states have consistently been a member of, although there were some threats from states in the last couple of years to withdraw, but that has never come to pass. So some of the key features of interstate compacts is that they cooperatively address shared problems, something like interstate licensure, but also sharing of natural resources is a very common use of interstate compacts. Something that you all might be familiar with is the Military Interstate Children's Compact, which focuses on graduation requirements and support systems for military children as they enter new school systems because of a transition in their parents' career. So that relates pretty closely to the work that we do with the education professions in interstate licensure compacts. So as kind of a brief overview of licensing compacts and their trends, the primary goal of these is to facilitate multi-state practice, or in the case of the teacher compact and the compact for school psychologists, to provide a seamless pathway to licensure between states after a permanent move. They have an overarching goal to maintain or improve public health and safety, as well as preserve state authority over their own licensing systems. 50 states and territories have adopted at least one compact, and 41 states, as well as Washington, D.C. and Guam, have adopted at least 3 of these interstate licensing compacts. Interstate compacts in general, most states are members of dozens. So those include, river compacts, natural resource compacts, as well as all of the 50 state compacts that all states are a member of. In the last 8 years, over 290 pieces of these occupational licensure compacts have been enacted in the states across the country, and 15 current professions have an interstate compact. So this is that list. It is consistently growing. We will have a believe it's on here already, but there will be a dietitians and nutritionists compact coming, as well as a compact for respiratory therapists. So this list is consistently growing as part of CSG's cooperative agreement with the Department of Defense, which is what facilitated this development project as well. So just some brief background on that cooperative agreement. It was started in 2020 as part of the National Defense Authorization Act to have the Defense State Liaison's Office, a branch of the Department of Defense, partner with the Council of State Governments to develop these, particularly to address the issues of professional mobility, underemployment, and unemployment for military spouses after a permanent change of station for their spouse. So military spouses are the most mobile demographic in the United States. On average, they move to a new state once every 2 years. So as you can imagine, being in a licensed profession for the duration of a spouse's military career can present significant barriers to maintaining consistent practice over the course of that time. So this is just a snapshot of the current membership of the interstate compacts. On the far right are the newest interstate compacts. So you'll see most of those have lower numbers. Those were between the Interstate Teacher Mobility Compact and the Social Work Compacts. Those were all released late 2022 to early 2023. So most of those have only been available for one legislative session. Whereas on the top left, the Nurse Licensure Compact and the IMLC have been available to the states for around 20 years. Development of these compacts is a long process. Our partners at NASP can attest that this is a significant undertaking, and so we greatly appreciate their partnership and work throughout this process. It started in, Eric, correct me if I have my dates wrong. I believe our first meeting of the technical assistance group was in September of 2022, if I'm correct about that. It may have been a couple months later. But that group is comprised of 20 state officials, stakeholders, and issue experts, including notably members of licensing offices, as well as state legislators that handle these issues directly. That group examined issues, current policy, and most importantly, focused on the uniformity that already exists in state licensing systems for school psychologists and in the status quo. So we always say that compacts are best built on uniformity and existing uniformity. And so the standards that we looked at when we developed the recommendations from the technical assistance group were based on that current uniformity that exists. And so we'll dive into that a little bit when we get to what the requirements are for a license under this compact. Those recommendations that were developed by the TAG were taken to a compact document team. This was a smaller group that was primarily made up of attorneys within state licensing offices and attorneys that deal specifically with compacts. They drafted the first version that was released for public comment for a period of 2 months in the summer of 2023. I am sure that all of you have at least seen it come across your emails or desks, that version. So we spent about 2 months gathering public comment, and then we took all of those comments, reviewed those with the original document team, and developed the final draft that was released to the states, as Hiro mentioned, in December 2023. So we're now in this phase 2 period of the compact development process, which really focuses on education, state support, and state enactments. So as I mentioned at the top, CSG's primary role is providing technical assistance and research-based advice to the states. And so we continue that work as part of phase 2 of our compact development processes for all of these compacts coming down the pipe. So that includes presenting to state committees, which we're going to talk about kind of in detail later on, as well as tracking and reviewing compact legislation. One important thing to note, the only way to join a compact is to pass it through both chambers of the state legislature, except for in the case of Nebraska, where there's only one, have it signed into law by the governor, and have that law on the books. So we make sure that each of those bills, states are agreeing to the same things. Since these are contracts, it's important that the legislation is substantially equivalent. So we work with states to make sure that that's true. Another piece that we provide in collaboration with NASP is our legislative resource kit. So that is available now. Provide some additional education materials, some summary materials and infographics on how the compact works. We're going to walk through a lot of that information today, but good resources both for you all in your conversations with stakeholders and state leaders, and great resources for the legislators themselves to know what the compact does, what they're getting into, and how it will work. We also have under this education umbrella a national convening, which is likely to take place this summer. And so I'm sure we will keep you all in the loop on the progress of that meeting as we get a little bit closer. And then lastly, we'll kind of breeze through this right now since we're still a little ways away, but the transition period and operation period under phase 3, this really goes in perpetuity from here on out. So once the compact reaches its threshold of 7 states have joined and the commission is stood up, the commission then becomes a self-reliant organization consisting of only the states. So this won't be an organization that's owned by NASP. It won't be an organization that's owned by CSG. This is an intergovernmental agency for the states, operated by the states. And so we'll talk about the commission in a little bit more detail, but this transition period is where we work to help get the commission set up and then let it move on its own. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the trends in compact passage. This is not meant to overly encourage or overly discourage anybody in this call, just to show that these bills are often a process. So a little bit of a disclaimer on this graph. The vast majority of these listed compacts have only been available for 1 year. So you'll see only real data for the majority of those for year 1 after the compact was made available. And as you can see, generally what we see is somewhere between 0 and 3, or if we go to the next slide with 10 states, between 0 and 10 states joining in that first year. We also generally see a trend of that number going up year to year. Probably the best example of a compact that isn't one of the first and isn't as new as others is the psychology compact. You'll see a steady climb of states joining. It can be for a number of reasons. After a state has hit its activation threshold, often states are able to see how it is operating, if it's up and running, if it's providing value to the states, and at that point, more states join on. Kind of our biggest outlier outside of the IMLC is, and likely an encouraging note for this group, is the teacher compact, which was released in late 2022, has had 1 year of legislative sessions and reached its activation number of 10 by that June. So there's no guarantee that we'll see the exact same trend follow with this compact, but we expect this to be seen by the same committees, much of the same legislators, and so I think that provides some encouragement as we move into the early legislative sessions this year. So we're going to jump into an overview of the legislation itself. I should have said this at the top, but we will have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So if you have something, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll get to it then, or hold on to it and we'll have plenty of time. So as I mentioned, the compact is really built around current best practice and uniformity in state licensing systems. So the recommendation from the TAG and what the document team took was building this really around what we see in the states right now, as well as NASP standards. So there's an important note here. You'll notice that the title of this is State Requirements on the License, not State Requirements on the Licensee. The important piece of that we replicated from the teacher compact last year is that as much as we can cut down on the bureaucratic red tape side of barriers to entry while maintaining the health, safety of our practitioners, our students, the better that we think the compact will operate. So if these requirements are put on the license rather than the individual, if the onus isn't on the individual then to prove that they've completed these things. That onus is placed on the state licensing authority, who have all of this at their fingertips and available because you already hold the license. And so that's the important distinction there. Just want to note that because it is something we get questions about pretty frequently for both this and the teacher compact. But those requirements for the baseline of a license to be considered eligible for the compact is that it requires a qualifying national exam, a qualifying school psychologist education program, and a minimum of 1,200 hours of supervised internship experience with 600 hours in a school. It's another important note here when we talk about scope of what practitioners the compact aims to cover. Those are school psychologists titled practicing or providing school psychological services in a school setting. So there are states that have additional licenses for school psychologists to practice independently. We're really focused here on school psychologists practicing in a school. So this really distills the function of the compact to a practitioner, along with the next slide, into its base components. So unlike something like the nursing compact, but much closer to the teacher compact, this isn't focused on granting a practitioner a license that allows them to practice in multiple states. This is about a seamless transition of license and an easier way to maintain multiple licenses for practitioners who wish to move to a new state or moving to a new state outside of professional reasons, or who wish to practice in multiple states under an existing state license. So for an individual practitioner who holds an eligible license that meets the requirements that we covered on the last slide in a member state, they can apply for a license in another member state, and then the information exchange system, which will be developed likely in partnership with the Commission for the Teacher Compact, will verify and validate that the license they hold is eligible for the compact and transfer any data that's needed to the new state for them to be able to essentially instantly issue a new license after a background check has been completed. So this is an area of compact policy that is often a sticking point when it's not clearly understood. But especially for this compact, background check policy will remain exactly the same as it does now for any practitioner becoming licensed in any state. So if they have specific regulations around background checks in any given state, the compact won't affect those at all. Any practitioner coming through the compact will need to complete those background check requirements. It's also important to note here, and I'm sure some of you are already running through this in your head, if there are individual unique requirements to the state, something like a specific sensitivity training, a state-specific jurisprudence exam, those can all remain in place after the license has been granted. So what we found in our stakeholder review for both the teacher compact and this compact is that many states have these state-specific requirements. I think a great example is something like Washington, a state like Washington, where they have some diversity, equity, and inclusion and sensitivity training that they've developed over the last several years, and they're understandably very hesitant to let go of those trainings. And so what we ask in the compact is that those be treated as continuing education rather than a barrier to licensure, and that will be fully up to the state on how they choose to operationalize that. So if you can think of those kinds of licensure requirements in your state, those won't need to go away. They'll just need to be placed a little bit later in the process. And then, as I mentioned, another key goal of this compact is the flexibility to be able to maintain multiple licenses in member states if somebody would wish to work in multiple states, somewhat concurrently. So whether that be somebody that lives in a border area and wants to work between two different school districts in two different states, or the potential for an expansion or continued use of telepractice or teledelivery of services across the country. It was the opinion of the technical assistance group and most of our stakeholder review that be a key component of the compact. And so The direction that was taken by the drafting team to address that need is this renewal provision, in which a practitioner only needs to complete the content requirements, so continuing education, additional exams in their home state. So the state that they used their license to get into the compact, that's the only state where they'll need to actively renew. And other states will treat active renewal of that home state license as the renewal requirements for their own state. Additional licenses would automatically renew as long as those administrative requirements are met. So whether that is paying a fee, which would be on a licensure renewal anyway, or completing a regular background check if that's already existing in state policy. Essentially, what this would mean is that if I was licensed in Colorado, but through the compact gain a license in Nebraska and Indiana, would only need to actively renew my license in Colorado and complete any fees or background checks that are required in the additional states. Another area that is generally really important to states to maintain authority over is discipline and revocation authority, or any type of adverse action on the license. So there are a couple of key components here. All discipline and revocation authority remains with the state. So there is no ability for the commission to take an action on your own state license. There's no ability for another member state to take an action on that state's license. So everybody maintains the same authority that they currently have on discipline and revocation. Another important piece is that the compact's goal is that any discipline data that would be shared with other states, that happens with increased regularity and more stringency. And so there's some specific provisions within the compact that require states to increase their authorization to share that discipline data with other compact member states so that they can make their own decision around discipline and revocation if that were needed. There's also this third bullet point. It is the goal that this will be integrated into current state systems like the NASDAQ clearinghouse, which is something all 50 states already use to share this discipline data. We believe as strongly as possible that the most seamless way to integrate these compacts into licensing systems is to incorporate them into already active systems and just beef them up to meet the needs of the compact. So that's why that bullet point is there. We'll kind of breeze through these other sections. So the back half of the model language, if you're reading through it or following along, is what we generally call the boilerplate. This is really about operating and facilitating the compact after the activation threshold is met. So this includes the Compact Commission, which we're going to talk about in more detail in just a minute. But as I already mentioned, a intergovernmental organization of the states only to facilitate the compact. There's a specific section about the Commission's rulemaking authority, the facilitating information exchange system, which I just described, oversight, dispute resolution, and enforcement between compact member states or between member states and non-member states as needed. Effective date, withdrawal, and amendment. The important note to here, which I've already hit on a couple of times, is that activation threshold of 7 states. This also provides the avenue through which a state could withdraw, which generally, and actually has never happened with one of these licensure compacts, as well as the avenue for amending the model legislation itself, which is something that we hope never has to happen. Construction and severability, the key piece to hit on here is that severability portion, which essentially states that if some part of the model legislation was found to be unconstitutional either by the US Supreme Court or by any individual state Supreme Court, that section is severable. It doesn't make the whole piece of legislation unconstitutional. And so that's an important note, especially where we might see conflict with individual state constitutions. Generally, those are changed to meet the needs of that state constitution prior to the compact being joined. If by chance it wasn't, or if new case law reflected a need to examine the constitutionality, that would still be a severable portion and the rest of the compact could stand. Not something that compacts run into very often. And then binding effect of the compact and conflict with other laws. This is one that sometimes gives legislators a little bit of a start, but is settled case law and has been for hundreds of years that when compacts have conflict with existing state laws or new state laws, then the compact supersedes those to the extent of the conflict, with the only exception being, as kind of I alluded to previously, conflict with a state constitution, in which case the constitution supersedes the compact. Okay, so what's next? So the next kind of, after legislative sessions are done, that 7-state threshold is met. The next kind of major step is standing up the Compact Commission. So I've hit on this a couple of times, but this is a joint governmental agency comprised of one representative from each member state. It's important to note that within the legislation, that representative is not a political appointee. It's somebody from within the licensing system, with the default being the administrative head of the office in the state government that handles educator licensing. And so this is somebody that's familiar with the licensing system, which is an important piece, not somebody who is a political appointee. The commission's primary prerogative and really legislatively limited operational capacity is to implement the compact. So they have rulemaking authority to do that. They are also there to be a flexible tool so that the commission can be and the compact can be an evergreen system. I mentioned that it's very difficult to amend compact legislation. It requires every member state to pass an identical amendment to the authorizing bill. So not something that these organizations want to go through. And so that is why the commission has rulemaking authority to be a flexible rulemaking authority to effectuate the compact. If that commission extends its boundary, which is limited by what is included in the legislation through rulemaking, those can both be struck down by the courts or be rejected by a majority of the member state legislatures. Important to note, as I said with discipline, rules can't apply to practitioners not seeking to practice via the compact. So this goes along with another important point of state sovereignty, that all existing pathways to licensure remain open even if a state joins the compact. So if a state has existing maybe bilateral reciprocity agreements with a neighboring state, or existing reciprocity for a certain level of school psychologists coming from another state, or in some states what we've seen is universal license recognition, all of those pathways remain open, as well as simply applying for a new license in another state. The compact only opens a new pathway to licensure and provides an additional tool to state regulators in granting licenses. And again, rules cannot extend beyond the implementation of the compact. They would likely be challenged in court. So we'll go over this pretty quickly. One of the kind of key pieces in compact legislation is we see some states tend to be very compact friendly. They like to pass these quickly and often. Some states don't generally like to pass compacts at all, although we're seeing less and less of that. More states are interested and active in joining these, especially these licensure compacts. And some states like to wait a couple of years, especially once the commission is up and running, before they jump in and join. And so this chart does a decent job of illustrating which states tend to be early adopters, from paler to darker being the early adopters to the later adopters. Is slightly, well, I won't say it's misleading. It's without a more complete picture, this can be a difficult chart to interpret, but it's a good kind of brief illustration of the states that are the most quick to join compacts. Those tend to be Utah, Colorado, Kentucky, Florida, and some others, but those tend to be kind of the earliest adopters. So now we're going to jump into how you all might like to be involved and how you might like how you might be able to get involved as a bill is filed in your state this session or a session in the future. At kind of the top level of involvement is finding a bill sponsor and helping to shepherd the compact through the legislative process as a consistent advocate for the bill. One thing that's important to note here to ensure that we're not unintentionally competing against each other and being as collaborative and sharing of resources as we can be. It's ideal if before you approach a sponsor, you reach out to Hero, Eric, and myself so that we can ensure that if there is already a sponsor that's working on a bill that we know about that might not be public information yet, we can help to develop co-sponsor relationships between the person that you've identified and the person that we've identified, or help to best decide where we should kind of focus our resources. At the next level, but still a certainly key part of this process is testifying in support at a committee hearing, either in person or providing written testimony in advance of a hearing. Most states have a pretty easy process at this point for submitting written testimony. A smaller and smaller every year number of states allow for remote testimony, which can make this a little bit easier. But it's important to note with kind of all of these avenues for voicing support of the bill, CSG and NASP are happy to help you with developing those testimony. If you've written something, we're happy to look over it and share our feedback. But this is something that you are more than welcome to do on your own as a bill is filed in your state. Another thing is to write letters of support to legislators on relevant committees. So we anticipate most of the bills to join the Compact for School Psychologists to go through education committees in both chambers of the legislature. In some cases, they'll be assigned to additional committees as well. They might be assigned to a budget or finance committee. They might be assigned to a rules committee. Some states have committees specifically focused on interstate agreements, but we expect the key committee hearings to be in education committees. Writing letters of support to legislators on those committees can be extremely beneficial, especially if it's your legislators. So if it's the person that is representing your district within the state, that is a great time to get involved and help kind of have your voice be heard. We'll also, so I think we're going to do this kind of as a collective, but writing general letters of support for us to host on the landing page. So we'll be talking about how state associations might be able to do this. So we'll have more information to share with you all about that if it's something that you're interested in. And then kind of at the lower level tier of involvement, but still really impactful and beneficial, is reviewing the link that I believe Eric put in the chat already, and sharing those educational resources and the model legislation with your network. It would be great to have lots of champions in each of your states to help champion these bills. And so that can be a great way to share this information. And if nothing else, then folks are more prepared when it becomes enacted in their states and what it means for them as practitioners. So always extremely beneficial to share that with your networks in the profession.
So, Adam, I'm just going to add a couple points. This is
Sure.
Stacy, and I just want to emphasize that for those of you as state leaders, one of the things you can do right now is if your state is likely to be a state that tries to become part of the compact, it's helpful. You don't usually get very much leeway before these bills drop in the state legislatures, and you may only get like a week or maybe 2 weeks at the most to plan for your testimony. So one of the things that's really helpful is having people who can tell a story about their own personal experiences. It's the whole, if you went to PPI, it's what we always talk about, putting a face on the issue, right? Bringing a personal story, a personal anecdote, showing a concrete example of how this particular bill would really benefit individuals in a state. And most importantly is really the issue of military spouses. Military spouses, as Adam pointed out, are the ones who are the most impacted by these licensure bills and having to get a new license every time they move. If you can find in your state a school psychologist who's a military spouse who can tell a story about the fact that they have had 3 or 4 licenses and they have had, paid this much money and it's been this complicated to track all of the professional development, that's a great person to have in the wings to help develop testimony that can be shared with through your state associations. Another example is rural areas where it's really hard to access service providers. A lot of times in states where you have, states touching other states, if the states actually were all part of the compact, and you had a practitioner down in a very rural area, down in a corner, connecting to other states, they could actually work in multiple states and serve multiple communities. And then, thereby getting more access available to, mental health and school psych services. And then any other people that maybe have high mobility jobs, just trying to find people who could really tell these stories and who could really help bring that personal look to it all is really important. And that's something that all the state associations can kind of start thinking about and doing now. And if you check with your state associations and you have a hard time finding somebody, go into some of the NASP interest groups, like the Military Families NASP interest group, and ask, is there anybody in here who has a story to tell from our state, and then build a relationship with them so that when the bill does get dropped, you can then quickly be able to put that testimony together and you won't be scrambling at the last minute. So just a suggestion or two in regards to developing that testimony.
Thank you, Stacy, and can't agree with you more. We often only have a couple of days of lead time before testimony is required, and so as much as we can do in advance, the better. This is a more important note for legislative staff and sponsors, but good information for you all to have when having communication with those folks. As I mentioned right at the top, compacts are legislatively enacted contracts between the states. So it's really important that the language is the same between the states, at least to what we would consider substantial equivalency. So we'll be working with legislative sponsors and legislative staff as early and often as is humanly possible. But as much as we can encourage the use of the direct model language from the CSG website, the better. And with that, I will open the floor to questions and happy to answer those. I'll also add, if we can answer questions that are specific to your state now. I've also put my email here. If you are curious about, your state's general aptitude for compact enactment, what compacts they're a member of, who has sponsored those bills, my email is there, and feel free to reach out. I'm always available.
Hi, I have a couple questions. I'm Jennifer Kirkpatrick. I'm in Arizona, and so regarding the language, I know you're using the term licensure. Is it going to matter if we call it certification versus licensure? When you think about that consistency across states, that's the first question. I have a follow-up.
No worries. So that's a great question, Jennifer. It won't matter what term you use. So we within the definitions, which is Article 2 of the model legislation, we define license to mean any of the terms that could mean an authorization to practice school psychology. So certification is fine, license is fine. Any term that states use is perfectly acceptable.
Okay, my second question is about the qualifications for this certification. So you're recommending that you have the national qualifying exam, and so that isn't a part of our state certification requirement at this time. And so I'm thinking that maybe like there's a step before this that we need to look at, which is our state certification requirements. We've already got it aligned, so they'll accept the NCSP. So there are definitely people who have taken it as a part of the route to becoming certified, but it's not required. And so I don't even think the state houses those exam scores. And so is that something we should be looking at maybe as a precursor to this interstate compact? Because I think Arizona would be open to it, but the certification piece isn't going to meet these base requirements.
Yeah, another great question. My first instinct is to say probably not. Arizona probably already meets the baseline requirements. So qualifying national exam is also a defined term, and within that defined term is the ability for the commission to approve exams by rule. And so as long as they are, I believe, and if somebody has it pulled up, they can correct me. I believe we use the term or equivalent within the definition. And so as long as Arizona's exam is deemed to be equivalent to a national exam by the commission, then they would meet the requirements. That being said, if that wasn't true, then it would be the way that this compact is structured and a little bit different than other compacts. Arizona could join the compact while they're working on their individual state requirements to meet those. The license then would just not be eligible until those requirements are met. So doesn't necessarily need to be a hold on the bill being filed in Arizona if that were to be the case. But my first instinct, and I'm happy to look into it in more detail and have a follow-up conversation about this, is that Arizona would already be qualified to join the compact.
So we don't have any kind of exam. You just need a degree in school psychology and an internship. So you're saying something in that would actually be a proxy for an exam? Or do you actually have to have some kind of exam?
You would probably,
You have to have an exam.
Yes, you would need to have an exam. So yeah, so this is something that we can work on and is a not uncommon in licensure compacts at all, that states tweak their in-state licensure requirements to meet the baseline of the compact. Yes, you would definitely need to have some kind of exam as a baseline requirement for licensure in Arizona. But happy to work with you on that. It's something that we do pretty frequently with compacts that have kind of that baseline requirement. Great questions.
Thank you.
How's it going? I'm Ben Ellis from Colorado. I think you guys have a sponsor for us, but I wanted to double check that.
We do. We have a number of sponsors for you all. So yes.
Sweet. All right. I was pretty sure, but I wanted to double check.
I believe it is being filed next week, if I'm correct. So
It's not there yet, and I know I've talked to legislators, so I'm fairly sure. But
yeah, we will. So for you all, where we have a bill that we see coming, which is we're still early in that process. Colorado just happens to be one of the first. We'll reach out to you all on what we anticipate being committee dates when we get them, and the opportunities for you all to participate if you'd like to.
cool.
Hey, I'm Julie Remarine in South Dakota, and so we just started talking with one of our state senators who is supportive of getting the bill introduced. So would it be best if I connected with all three of you as a contact point, and then I can get you in touch with our senator and her team and everything?
Yes, that would be great. We would be
Okay.
Really, as long as everybody's in the loop, that's great. There's no, nobody needs to clear anything with us. We don't have any sort of authority. But as long as everybody's in the loop, and then we know that we're not needing to look for an additional sponsor, then that's great. So introductions are great. And then that's all up to you all.
Okay, great. I think they had asked me to to connect with the national group, so I was just wanting to make sure.
The other resource that's available that I should just say now for all of you is the Defense State Liaison's office, who is the cooperative agreement with CSG to develop this compact. They have regional liaisons for every state, and so if you're in need of somebody to really speak to that military spouse perspective, those are great people to look to, and we're happy to to connect you all with that group as we see bills filed.
Hey, this is April. I'm from Kentucky. I was just wondering if you all had any leads in our state.
Great question, April, as I sit in Lexington now.
Hey.
Yes, I think we do. So I gave a presentation there was an interim committee on student safety and mental health this off session. And I believe there is somebody within that group that is planning to sponsor, still doing follow-up calls with the members of that interim committee, but I will absolutely keep you in the loop as we get more information.
Please do. It's going to be kind of a tumultuous year legislatively in Kentucky as far as student mental health. Obviously, if you're in Lexington and if you're kind of working in those groups, then you know that. But we do have a lot of allies. So
yes, and we had pretty strong support for the teacher impact last session. So I'm hopeful that we can receive that same support this session, but I hear you about the tumult and understand.
Yeah. Thank you.
Austin, on Florida, we haven't gotten any direct information on Florida yet. We welcome your suggestions. It was a unanimous passage by Florida for the teacher compact in 2023. So I'm hopeful we can look to the same sponsors there. But if you have other suggestions or folks that you're talking to or know, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to have that conversation. Florida is generally a very compact friendly state.
Is having your NCSP going to be built into this in any way, or is it only going to be if it's a path to certification in your state?
Great question. So compacts as a rule try not to name third-party certification by name. So the goal was to build the compact around as close to equivalent to NCSP requirements as we could, but to preserve the state sovereignty piece and the evergreen nature of compacts, we generally avoid naming those additional certifications as a named part of a compact requirement. So NCSP as a signifier isn't a direct entryway into the compact. Great question. All right, not seeing any other questions. Eric, Hero, Stacy, anything that I said to the last group and I'm forgetting to say now, or anything else that you all want to add before we sign off tonight?
Just a reminder to use the legislative toolkit, remembering that details talking points for you and helps you sort of navigate it. Eric put that link in the chat box. And then again, if you can, just reach out to NASP for, before you firm up anything with any legislators, reach out to NASP and CSG. And if you want us to review anything, send that information on to Eric and to Hero also.
I'll add one thing that came up in our earlier webinar, which may apply to some of you, which is a few people asked on the last webinar to which school psychology license or certification this might apply to. And that question was asked specifically among one of a handful of states that have school psychologist licensure for practice in schools as a school psychologist, which is kind of like the bread and butter of what we do, as well as some other license issued by a different state agency to practice outside of schools, be it under a similar title as school psychologist or something related to that. This compact is very specific to the practice as a school psychologist in schools. It does not transfer over or apply to those other licenses.
Okay, well, thank you all again for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your support. I'll hit on it one last time. I'm always available. Feel free to reach out to me by email. As we approach committee hearings in your states, I'm always happy to review testimony, work with you on developing testimony. Anything like that that you might need, we're available for. Connecting with DoD folks that that may be helpful as well. We're happy to do that. And then last thing that I'm sure will happen, if you come across yourself a technical question that you need support for, or if you're asked a technical question that you need support for, Eric, Hero, Stacy, and I are all going to be able to answer those questions. So feel free to reach out to any or all of us on kind of compact specific questions. Some state legislators are very used to working with this kind of legislation, and some aren't. And so that's what I'm here for. If you need additional support in those conversations, hopefully I'll already be in them, but if I'm not, I'm available to help with those. So we really appreciate you all taking the time tonight, and hope you have a great rest of your evening. And we look forward to working with you all over the next year or so, or longer, depending on your own state. So thanks again, and have a great evening.